The trunks were already half-filled before Jennifer Lawrence even knew she was leaving. The morning light in the hallway was thin, filtering through the dust of a house that had been quietly dying for years. Jennifer's hair was still pinned in its nighttime braid when she heard the frantic scraping of wood against floorboards. She found Sarah, her lady's maid, folding the blue silk, the dress Jennifer had worn to the Henderson ball, with hands that wouldn't stop trembling. Sarah didn't look up. She just kept packing. Her body knew what Jennifer's mind hadn't yet been told. The house no longer belonged to them. Jennifer didn't scream. She didn't ask Sarah for an explanation. She simply turned and walked toward her father's study, her face already settling into the cool, marble mask she had perfected over 3 seasons of disappointment. Inside, the study smelled of stale brandy and scorched paper. Lord Lawrence sat behind his desk, a man defeated by his own greed. He didn't look at her. He looked at the heavy, cream-colored parchment lying between them like a blade. "Sit, Jennifer," he muttered. "I will stand, father. Tell me what has been sold." He didn't speak. He simply pushed the paper toward her. Jennifer picked it up. She read it once, then a second time. By the third reading, her pulse was drumming against her ribs, a wild, trap thing, but she kept her fingers steady. She would not give him the satisfaction of her fay. The document was a ledger of ruin. Every debt her father had accrued, every failed investment, every lost hand of cards, was listed in a cold, precise hand. But it was the bottom clause that made the world tilt. In exchange for the total sum of the Lawrence debt, the hand of Miss Jennifer Lawrence shall be given in immediate marriage to Mycroft, Duke of Ashford. Jennifer placed the paper back on the desk with the same care one might use to set a loaded pistol down. "Ashford," she whispered. The name felt like winter. "The man hasn't stepped foot in London since my debut 3 years ago." "He has been observant," her father said, his voice cracking. "He knew exactly what I owed. He knew exactly what I had to trade. And you traded me. He asked for you by name, Jennifer, he said." Her father hesitated, looking toward the window that faced the gardens. "He said you were precisely as described." The words chilled her more than the debt. As described. By whom? Who had been watching her in the 3 years of silence since she first stepped onto a ballroom floor? "When does he arrive?" Jennifer asked. "He is already here." Jennifer turned. Through the open door of the study, she saw a shadow in the foyer. A man stood there, silhouetted against the morning sun. He wore a traveling coat of dark charcoal, his gloves already removed, revealing hands that looked capable of both great violence and terrifying precision. Mycroft, the Duke of Ashford, didn't look at her father. His gaze was fixed entirely on Jennifer. It wasn't the look of a stranger, it was the look of a man reclaiming a prize he had been tracking for a long, long time. Jennifer didn't wait for an introduction. She turned and walked past him, her chin high, the silk of her dressing gown hissing against the floor. She made it to her room, closed the door, and locked it. Only then did she allow her hands to shake. She looked at her vanity, at the specific arrangement of her brushes, at the way the light hit her bed. She realized with a jolt of horror that Ashford Manor wouldn't be a new world. If he had been watching her for years, he didn't just want her hand. He wanted to own the very air she breathed.
Hello, you fanatic of Victorian love stories. Please hit the like and subscribe button. It helps me bring more tales of love, longing, and history to you. Now let's get back to our story.
The trunks were already half-filled before Jennifer Lawrence even knew she was leaving. The morning light in the drafty hallway was thin, filtering through the dust of a house that had been quietly dying for years. Jennifer's hair was still pinned in its nighttime braid when she heard the frantic scraping of wood against floorboards. She found Sarah, her lady's maid, folding a dress of lavender silk, the one Jennifer had worn to the Henderson ball, with hands that wouldn't stop trembling. Sarah didn't look up. She just kept packing. Her body knew what Jennifer's mind hadn't yet been told. The house no longer belonged to them. Jennifer didn't scream. She didn't ask Sarah for an explanation. She simply turned and walked toward her father's study, her face already settling into the cool, marble mask she had perfected over 3 seasons of disappointment. Inside, the study smelled of stale brandy and scorched paper. Lord Lawrence sat behind his desk, a man defeated by his own greed. He didn't look at her. He looked at the heavy, cream-colored parchment lying between them like a blade. "Sit, Jennifer," he muttered. "I will stand, father. Tell me what has been sold." He didn't speak. He simply pushed the paper toward her. Jennifer picked it up. She read it once, then a second time. By the third reading, her pulse was drumming against her ribs, a wild, trap thing, but she kept her fingers steady. She would not give him the satisfaction of her fay. The document was a ledger of ruin. Every debt her father had accrued, every failed investment, every lost hand of cards, was listed in a cold, precise hand. But it was the bottom clause that made the world tilt. In exchange for the total sum of the Lawrence debt, the hand of Miss Jennifer Lawrence shall be given in immediate marriage to Mycroft, Duke of Ashford. Jennifer placed the paper back on the desk with the same care one might use to set a loaded pistol down. Ashford, she whispered. The name felt like winter. The man hasn't stepped foot in London since my debut 3 years ago. He has been observant, her father said, his voice cracking. He knew exactly what I owed. He knew exactly what I had to trade. And you traded me. He asked for you by name, Jennifer, he said. Her father hesitated, looking toward the window that faced the gardens. He said you were precisely as described. The words chilled her more than the debt. As described. By whom? Who had been watching her in the 3 years of silence since she first stepped onto a ballroom floor? When does he arrive? Jennifer asked. He is already here. Jennifer turned. Through the open door of the study, she saw a shadow in the foyer. A man stood there, silhouetted against the morning sun. He wore a traveling coat of dark charcoal, his gloves already removed, revealing hands that looked capable of both great precision and terrifying control. Mycroft, the Duke of Ashford, didn't look at her father. His gaze was fixed entirely on Jennifer. It wasn't the look of a stranger. It was the look of a man reclaiming a prize he had been tracking for a long, long time. He stepped into the light, his eyes scanning her face with a familiarity that felt like a physical touch. The carriage is waiting, Jennifer, he said, his voice a low, resonant hum. I believe your trunks are already prepared. The carriage was a silent, velvet-lined vault that smelled of cedar and expensive leather. For the first hour of the 4-hour journey toward Wiltshire, Jennifer focused entirely on the landscape blurring past the window. She watched the sprawling chaos of London give way to the rhythmic, rolling greens of the countryside, her spine held as rigid as a corset stay. She refused to acknowledge the man sitting opposite her, yet she could feel Mycroft's presence like the steady pull of a tide. He did not attempt to fill the silence with the hollow pleasantries typical of a suitor. Instead, he remained perfectly still, a book resting closed upon his knee. When the carriage hit a particularly deep rut, Jennifer's hand flew to the door handle to steady herself. Her gaze inadvertently flickered to him, and she found him watching her with a terrifying, quiet intensity. You will find the library at Ashford much more extensive than your father's, Mycroft said, his voice cutting through the rattle of the wheels. I've had the new translation of the history of the Renaissance brought down from London. I believe you found the previous edition's footnotes to be lacking. Jennifer felt a cold prickle of sweat at the nape of her neck. She hadn't touched that book in over a year, and she had never discussed it with her father or any of her suitors. I don't recall mentioning that to anyone, Your Grace. You spoke of it, he replied, his expression unreadable. At Lady Barrington's garden party, in the summer of 1889, you were standing near the topiary, speaking to a young lieutenant who was far more interested in your smile than your intellect. You mentioned the translation felt rushed. Jennifer's breath hitched. That was 3 years ago. We weren't even introduced. I don't believe we were even in the same quadrant of the garden. I was behind the trellis, Mycroft said simply, as if the admission were nothing more than a comment on the weather. You wore a dress the color of bruised plums. You looked at the lieutenant and realized he couldn't follow your thought process, and for a moment, you looked entirely alone in the world. I decided then that you shouldn't have to be. The air in the carriage suddenly felt too thick to breathe. It wasn't just that he remembered. It was that he had been close enough to hear her whispered frustrations, close enough to see the fleeting shadows of her mind. He hadn't just been a face in the crowd. He had been a ghost in her life, gathering fragments of her identity like a scavenger. You've been collecting me, she whispered, her voice trembling despite her best efforts. Like a specimen. I have been ensuring that when you finally arrived at Ashford, you would find nothing wanting, he counted. Every book, every tea, every shade of silk in your chambers has been chosen because I know it is what you prefer. You have spent your life performing for a society that does not see you, Jennifer. In my house, there is no need for the mask. He reached out then, not to touch her, but to offer the book on his lap. It was the very translation he had mentioned. Jennifer looked at his hands, steady, sure, and terrifyingly patient. She realized then that the debt was merely the key he had used to unlock the door. The cage itself had been under construction for years. Ashford Manor rose out of the Wiltshire mist like a sleeping leviathan, its grey stone walls weathered by centuries of secrets. As the carriage slowed to a halt, Jennifer felt the weight of the house pressing against her chest. She stepped onto the gravel, her eyes tracing the high, arched windows that seemed to watch her return with a cold, knowing grace. Mycroft did not offer his hand. He simply stood aside, a silent sentinel ushering her into a life already drafted in his image. The foyer was a cathedral of shadow and polished oak, but it was the upstairs chamber that stole the breath from her lungs. When the heavy door swung open, Jennifer stopped on the threshold, her hand clutching the frame. The walls were a soft, muted sage, a very specific, elusive shade of green that she had described only once, a fleeting wish whispered to a friend during a walk through the Kew Conservatory years ago. It was the color of moss under moonlight, a shade her father had called unfashionable and melancholy. Here, it was a sanctuary. She moved into the room, her footsteps muffled by a rug that felt like walking on cloud. There was a peculiar, unsettling stillness to the air. It took her several moments to realize what was missing. The room was devoid of mirrors. Where a grand, gilded looking-glass should have hung above the vanity, there was only the smooth, unbroken expanse of that haunting green paint. In a world where she had been forced to check her reflection at every turn, to ensure the mask of composure had not slipped, to verify that she looked the part of the dutiful daughter, the absence of her own image was a jarring liberation. In place of mirrors, there were shelves. They lined the far wall, stretching toward the high ceiling, and as Jennifer scanned the spines, the blood left her face. These were not the leather-bound classics one kept for show. These were her books. Not the ones she had been seen reading in the drawing room, but the ones she hid under her pillow. There was the battered volume of radical poetry she'd bought in secret, the obscure botanical journals, and the tattered Gothic romance with the spine she'd broken herself. Every title was a confession. She turned to find Mycroft standing in the doorway, his silhouette cutting a sharp line against the hallway light. He didn't come inside, respecting the invisible boundary of the threshold, yet his presence filled the space entirely. "There are no mirrors here, Jennifer," he said, his voice dropping to that low, resonant hum that made her skin prickle. "You have spent enough of your life being a reflection for others. I thought you might appreciate a room where you are only required to be yourself." "How?" she whispered, her fingers trailing over the sage-colored wall. "How could you possibly know about this color? About these books?" "You once said that mirrors only show what the world expects to see," he replied, his gaze unwavering. "And you said this green was the only color that felt like a hell breath. I haven't forgotten a single word you've ever spoken, even the ones you thought were lost to the wind." He bowed slightly, a gesture of terrifyingly polite possessiveness. "Rest now. Dinner will be served when the light hits the base of the clock. It is the time of day you once told the Henderson girl was your favorite for eating." He closed the door, leaving her alone in a room that was a perfect map of her soul, a map drawn by a man she had only just met, but who had clearly lived in her shadows for years. The silence of Ashford Manor was not empty. It was a heavy, expectant thing that seemed to breathe with her. Driven by a restless need to find the edges of her cage, Jennifer slipped from her sage-colored sanctuary and navigated the labyrinthine corridors. She found herself drawn to a door at the end of the east wing, a room that smelled of ink, old parchment, and the same cedar scent that clung to Mycroft. The Duke's study was a temple of order, but it was the small, velvet-lined box resting on the central desk that pulled her forward. It sat open, catching the dying amber rays of the afternoon sun. Jennifer reached out, her fingers trembling as she lifted the object inside. It was a miniature, encased in a frame of delicate gold filigree. She stared down at her own face. It was Jennifer, but not the woman who had stood defiant in her father's study that morning. This was the girl from 3 years ago, the girl at her debut ball. The artist had captured the exact tilt of her head, the nervous brightness in her eyes, and the stray, copper crewel that had escaped her coiffure to rest against her collarbone. It was painted with a devastating, frightening intimacy, yet the brushstrokes were slightly soft, lacking the clinical precision of a sitting. It had been painted from memory. "I didn't commission that," she whispered to the empty room, her heart hammering against her ribs. "I never sat for a miniature." "Because you didn't have to." Mycroft was standing in the shadows by the bookshelves, his presence so still she hadn't realized he was there. He stepped into the light, his gaze falling on the portrait in her hand with a strange, possessive reverence. "The artist worked under my specific direction," he said, his voice as calm as a frozen lake. "It took 6 months to get the light in your eyes exactly right." He complained that no woman truly looked that way when she thought she was alone. I told him he simply hadn't been watching closely enough. Jennifer turned on him, the miniature clutched so tightly the gold frame bit into her palm. The shock was finally curdling into a sharp, cold rage. "This isn't admiration, Mycroft. It's a violation. You've spent 3 years haunting my life like a ghost. You watched me fail, you watched my father ruin us, and you waited until I was a debt to be collected." She stepped toward him, the small portrait held up like an accusation. "You didn't want a wife. You wanted to finish your gallery. Who gave you the right to memorize a woman who didn't even know you existed?" Mycroft didn't flinch at her anger. If anything, he leaned into it, his eyes darkening. "I didn't wait for you to be ruined, Jennifer. I ensured that when the ruin inevitably came, I was the only hand reaching out to catch you. You call it a violation. I call it the only honest thing in your life. Your father saw a bargaining chip. London saw a pretty face. I am the only man who saw you." "You saw a memory," she shot back, her voice echoing off the high stone walls. "You saw a girl at a ball and decided she was yours to cure it. You don't know me. You only know the version of me you've built in your head." Mycroft took a slow, deliberate step into her space, his shadow engulfing her. "Then prove me wrong," he challenged softly. "Spend your days showing me the parts one missed. But do not pretend that you weren't screaming to be seen. I simply was the only one listening." The miniature still felt like a brand against her palm as Jennifer turned her attention to the lower cabinets of the desk, driven by a frantic, sickening curiosity. She pulled at a heavy mahogany drawer, expecting to find ledgers or land deeds. Instead, she found a stack of programs from Covent Garden, meticulously organized and bound by silken thread. She pulled the top one free, Tristan und Isolde, from the previous spring. Her breath hitched as she opened the cover. Inside, Mycroft's precise, architectural hand had made notations in the margins. It wasn't a critique of the music. Seat 4B, the ink read. She wore the pearls with the silver clasp. She did not weep at the finale, though she held her breath for exactly 10 seconds. Jennifer flipped through the stack, her movements growing more desperate. Don Giovanni, 1888. La Traviata, 1890. Every performance she had ever attended was represented here. On the back of each program was a list of her companions, the names of the aunts who had chaperoned her, the young lords who had tried to catch her eye, even the cousins she had sat with in the shadows of the box. Beside each name was a brief, cold assessment of their character, or more accurately, their lack of worth. "You were there," she whispered, the paper crinkling under her grip. "Every time. I felt a chill in the theater, a sense of eyes on the back of my neck, and I told myself it was merely the draft of an old building." "It was never the draft," Mycroft said. He had not moved from the shadows, but his voice seemed to wrap around her, as suffocating as the velvet curtains of a private box. "I have attended every performance you attended. I have sat in the dark and learned the rhythm of your laughter. I have watched the way you lean forward when the soprano hits a high C, and the way you look at the exit when the conversation in your box turns to gossip." Jennifer dropped the programs as if they were made of hot coals. They scattered across the rug, a paper trail of her life that she had never consented to share. "You didn't just watch me, Mycroft. You haunted me. You turned my only moments of joy into a ledger of observations. I turned them into a study of your soul," he countered, taking a slow, predatory step forward. "I saw the way you looked at the stage, with a hunger for something more than the narrow life your father had planned for you. I was not a ghost, Jennifer. I was a witness. While those boys were looking at your neckline, I was looking at the way you clenched your hands in your lap when the music spoke of a freedom you thought you'd never have." He stopped just inches from her, the scent of cedar and iron filling her senses. "I did not want to miss a single moment of your becoming. I knew that one day, the music would stop and your father would run out of luck. I simply made sure that when you looked into the darkness for a way out, I was the only thing you would find." Jennifer looked up at him, her horror mingling with a dark, twisted realization. He hadn't just bought her, he had memorized her until she felt she no longer belonged to herself. She was a melody he had learned by heart, and now, he was finally ready to play the final note. The paper trail did not end with opera programs and stolen likenesses. Jennifer's hands moved with a cold, clinical efficiency now, her fear having sharpened into a blade of pure, investigative ice. She bypassed the sentimental thefts of the upper drawers and reached for the heavy, locked ledger at the bottom of the cabinet. It yielded with a sharp snap of its brass mechanism, a sound like a bone breaking in the quiet of the study. Inside were the architectural plans of her father's destruction. She found the correspondence first. Letters from solicitors she recognized, dates that aligned perfectly with her father's frantic, late-night pacing in London. Here was the East India venture that had promised to save the Lawrence estate, and there, in a bold, unwavering stroke of ink, was the order to withdraw the Ashford capital. It had happened in a single afternoon. Mycroft had pulled the foundation out from under the investment, knowing the collapse would create a vacuum that only he could fill. He had not merely watched her father gamble. He had built the table, weighted the dice, and then waited for the house to win. Each page was a new revelation of calculated ruin. Mycroft had systematically bought up her father's secondary debts from tailors, vintners, and horse traders, consolidating them into one singular, crushing mountain of obligation. He had waited until the weight was enough to snap her father's spine, then presented the promissory note with its specific, human collateral. "You didn't catch me when I fell," Jennifer said, her voice a hollow rasp as she stared at a bank draft signed by Mycroft 6 months ago, the exact amount of her father's final ruin. "You pushed me." She didn't hear him move, but suddenly the air behind her grew warm. Mycroft was there, his shadow falling over the evidence of his own treachery. He did not reach out to close the ledger. He stood and looked at the records of his engineering as if they were a masterpiece he had finally finished. "Your father was a man who would have traded you to a different wolf every season until there was nothing left of you," Mycroft said, his tone devoid of apology. "He was a leak in a ship that was destined to sink. I simply accelerated the process to ensure you weren't lost to the open sea." "You manufactured my misery," she hissed, turning to face him. The ledger lay open between them, a map of a 3-year siege. "You broke my family. You stripped me of my home, my name, and my choice. You didn't love me, Mycroft. You hunted me." "Choice is a luxury for those who are not drowning," he replied, his eyes dark with a terrifying, absolute conviction. "I knew your father's nature. I knew the men who were circling you. If I had let the ruin happen on its own, you would have been sold to a man like Hartwell or Calder, men who would have used you and discarded you. I chose to be the one who owned the debt because I am the only one who knows what you are truly worth." He reached out then, his thumb grazing the edge of the mahogany desk, inches from her shaking hand. "The debt was the only way to get you behind these walls, Jennifer. Now that you are here, the debt is gone. The papers are burned the moment you say the word. But do not ask me to regret the engineering of this moment. I have spent 3 years building a world that fits you, and I would burn London to the ground if it meant you were safe within it." The evening air on the stone terrace was sharp with the scent of damp earth and the dying perfume of late summer roses. Jennifer stood by the balustrade, her fingers white-knuckled against the cold masonry. Behind her, the light from the library spilled out in a long, golden rectangle, framing Mycroft as he stepped into the darkness. The silence between them was no longer the silence of strangers. It was the heavy, charged quiet of two people who had finally stripped away the polite fictions of their station. "You speak of safety as if it justifies the theft of a life," Jennifer said, her voice barely a whisper against the wind. She did not turn to look at him. She couldn't. "You built a cage of sage-colored paint and old books, and you used my father's greed to lock the door. You engineered every moment of his desperation." "I engineered the opportunity," Mycroft corrected, his voice steady, though there was a new, jagged edge to his tone. "I did not have to manufacture your father's failure, Jennifer. I merely gave it a destination. I withdrew the capital because I would not see my wealth used to prolong a gambler's delusions. I bought the debts because I refused to let your future be haggled over in the backrooms of clubs I despise." He moved closer, his presence a warmth she found herself hating for its familiarity. "But I did not engineer your presence here tonight. That was the only variable I could not calculate." Jennifer turned then, her eyes bright with a mixture of fury and disbelief. "You held the promissory note. You named the price. What choice did I have?" "You could have refused," he said, and for the first time, she saw a flicker of something human, something vulnerable, behind the Duke's impenetrable mask. "You could have stayed in London. You could have let the bailiffs take the furniture and lived in a cottage in the slums. You could have appealed to your aunts or fled to the continent. I sat in that carriage 4 hours ago with the weight of 3 years of planning in my chest, and I was terrified. Jennifer let out a sharp, bitter laugh. "The Duke of Ashford, terrified." "Terrified that you would see through the debt," he admitted, stepping into the moonlight. His face was pale, his features etched with a grim honesty. "I feared you would realize that a promissory note is only paper if the person it binds refuses to be broken. I stood in your father's study waiting for you to look at me with the contempt I deserved and tell me to go to hell. I had the documents in my pocket to clear the debt regardless of your answer. I had already lost the money, Jennifer. I was prepared to lose the hope of you, too." He reached out, his hand hovering near hers on the stone, but he did not touch her. "You chose to walk into that carriage. You chose to maintain your composure. You chose to come to Ashford. You think I am the architect of your imprisonment, but I have spent every moment since we arrived waiting for you to realize that the door has never been locked. I engineered the ruin, yes, but I could never engineer the way you looked at me when you realized I knew the color of your walls. That was the only thing I truly wanted, and the only thing I had no power to take." Jennifer looked down at his hand, then out at the dark, rolling expanse of the Wiltshire hills. The cage was open, just as he said. The realization was more frightening than the debt itself, for it meant the anger she had used as armor was beginning to dissolve, leaving her standing in the moonlight with a man who knew her better than she knew herself. The heavy silence of Ashford Manor shifted from an expectant hum to a hollow, aching void. For 3 days, the seat at the head of the dining table remained empty, the fine bone china and silver laid out for a man who never arrived. Mycroft had vanished into the sprawling geography of his own house, retreating into the shadows as if his confession on the terrace had exhausted his right to be seen. Jennifer moved through the sage-colored rooms like a ghost haunting her own life. The peculiar alchemy of the house continued without its master. Her tea appeared at the precise moment she craved it, the fire in her grate was stoked to the exact height she preferred, and fresh volumes of poetry appeared on her nightstand as if by magic. The impossible knowledge of her needs was still being serviced by an invisible army of servants, yet the architect of the comfort was gone. Without the friction of Mycroft's gaze, the luxury of the manor felt like a museum, beautiful, preserved, and utterly dead. She found herself pausing in the hallways, listening for the rhythmic click of his boots or the low, resonant vibration of his voice in the study. On the second night, she stood before the empty place setting at dinner, her hand hovering over the back of his chair. The anger that had sustained her, the righteous fury of the collected specimen, was beginning to evaporate, leaving behind a cold, startling clarity. She had spent 3 years resenting the society that saw only her face, yet she was now realizing that Mycroft's observation had been the only thing that made her feel substantial. He had built a world that fit her perfectly, but in his absence, she realized the world was not the point. The point was the man who had cared enough to memorize the curve of her soul. By the third evening, Jennifer walked to the library, the one room she knew he frequented. The door was ajar, a sliver of light spilling onto the floor, but when she pushed it open, the room was vacant. Only the scent of cedar and old paper remained. She looked at the desk where the opera programs had been scattered, now tied it into a neat, silent stack. The withdrawal was complete. He was offering her the one thing she thought she wanted, a life where he did not intrude. The terror she felt then was far sharper than the fear of the debt. It was the realization that in his effort to set her free, he was taking the witness with him. She looked at the sage-green walls and realized they were just paint, the books were just paper. It was the fact that someone had known to choose them that mattered. She didn't want the cage, but she discovered, with a jolt that shook her to her core, that she no longer wanted to be unknown. The door was wide open, the carriage was at her disposal, and the debt was a ghost, yet Jennifer found she could not move toward the exit. She was no longer a prize being tracked. She was a woman realizing that the only man who truly saw her was the only one she couldn't bear to leave in the dark. The door to the inner sanctum did not resist her. It swung open with a heavy, oiled smoothness, admitting Jennifer into the heart of Mycroft's obsession. The air here was cooler, thick with the scent of vellum and the metallic tang of fresh ink. She did not head for the bookshelves this time. She went for the high, narrow cabinets that stood like sentinels behind his desk. What she found inside was not a library, but a biography of a woman who had not yet finished living. Jennifer pulled out a ledger bound in midnight blue leather. As she turned the pages, her breath hitched in a ragged sob of disbelief. It was not just a record of where she had been, but a transcription of who she was. There, in Mycroft's unwavering hand, were fragments of conversations she had held at garden parties and soirees, sentences she had uttered to trivial men, recorded here as if they were scripture. February 14, 1890, she told Lord Byron's nephew that the winter was too long for those who do not dream. He did not understand. I did. She moved to the next drawer, her fingers trembling so violently the parchment rattled. It was a visual inventory of her wardrobe. Every dress she had worn for 3 years was described in excruciating, painterly detail. The specific weight of the lace on her sleeves, the exact shade of the ribbons in her hair, the way a particular silk moved when she turned. Beside a sketch of her yellow ball gown, a note read, "The color is too loud for her. It swallows the amber in her eyes. She wears it because her mother loved it, not because she does." The deeper she delved, the more intimate the intrusion became. She found a section dedicated to the great influenza that had swept through London 2 winters prior. Jennifer had been confined to her bed for 3 weeks, drifting in and out of fever dreams, believing herself forgotten by the world. But here was the record of her suffering, her temperature readings, the names of the doctors her father had summoned, and a list of the specific tinctures delivered anonymously to their doorstep. Day 12. The cough has deepened. If the fever does not break by dawn, I shall intervene regardless of the scandal. It was a chilling, absolute documentation of her existence. He had tracked her health, her moods, and her disappointments with the clinical devotion of a scientist and the terrifying fervor of a devotee. He had known when she was lonely, when she was bored, and when she was masking a headache with a practiced smile. Jennifer leaned against the desk, the weight of being so thoroughly known pressing down on her like a physical hand. Every secret she thought she had kept, every private moment of grief or fleeting thought of rebellion, had been observed, catalogued, and filed away in this room. She was not just a woman to him, she was a text he had spent 1,000 nights studying. She heard the soft click of the door closing behind her. She didn't have to turn to know he was there. The atmosphere in the room shifted, growing dense with the gravity of his presence. He had allowed her to see it, the full, terrifying scope of his observation. Now, surrounded by the paper remains of her own life, Jennifer realized that the man standing in the shadows didn't just own her debt, he owned her history. The silence of the dining hall had become a physical weight, a vast expanse of polished mahogany and flickering candlelight that separated them more effectively than any stone wall. When Mycroft finally appeared, he did not offer an apology for his days of absence. He simply took his seat at the head of the table, his movements shadowed by the same weary grace Jennifer had observed since their arrival. The air between them was thick with the ghost of a library, the knowledge of the ledgers and the transcribed years hanging over the silver service like a shroud. Throughout the first course, neither spoke. The only sound was the rhythmic clink of crystal and the distant, mournful whistle of the wind against the manor's eaves. Jennifer watched him, her gaze fixed on the dark leather of his gloves. He had never removed them in her presence, not during the 4-hour journey, not during the tense confrontations in the study. They were a part of his armor, a final barrier that even his obsession had not dared to breach. As the second course was placed before them, Mycroft paused. His gaze met hers, and for a fleeting second, the terrifying certainty in his eyes wavered, replaced by a raw, uncharacteristic hesitation. Slow, deliberate, he reached for the first button at his wrist. The leather creaked as he peeled it back. He laid the gloves aside, placing them on the white linen like discarded weapons. Jennifer's breath caught. His hands were not the smooth, aristocratic appendages she had imagined. From the knuckles to the wrists, the skin was a pale, distorted landscape of puckered silver and translucent ridges, the unmistakable marks of a fire that had tried to consume him long ago. They were hands that had clawed through heat and ash, hands that bore the permanent record of a pain he could never catalogue or file away. "A fire in the nursery at Ashford," he said, his voice low, stripped of its usual clinical detachment. He looked down at his own palms as if seeing them for the first time. "I was 6. I spent a year in a room much like the one I gave you, hidden away because my mother could not bear to look at the ruin of her son. I learned then that the world only values what is unblemished. I learned to watch from the shadows because I believed the light was for those who were perfect." He picked up his fork, his scarred fingers moving with a slight, stiff tremor. "I spent 3 years documenting your life because I wanted to ensure that when I finally brought you here, you would find a world that was perfect for you. But I realize now that I was merely building another nursery to hide in. I was so afraid of you seeing the ruin of the man who bought you that I forgot you were the only person I ever wanted to truly look at me." Jennifer looked from his hands to his face, the horror of his collection suddenly colliding with the staggering vulnerability of his confession. For years, she had been a specimen under his glass, but in this moment, the glass had shattered. He wasn't the invincible architect of her fate. He was a man who had been burning since childhood, trying to build a sanctuary out of paper and ink. The power dynamic shifted, the cold sage-green walls of the room suddenly feeling less like a cage and more like a shared secret. The return to London felt like stepping back into a dream that had lost its color. The Pembroke ballroom was a frantic sea of shimmering silk, artificial laughter, and the suffocating scent of gardenias, a world Jennifer had once maneuvered with the practiced grace of a prisoner in a well-lit yard. Beside her, Mycroft was a pillar of dark, restrained elegance. He had donned his gloves once more, the leather a barrier between his history and the prying eyes of the ton, yet Jennifer could still feel the phantom heat of the scars he had revealed at Ashford. As the orchestra struck up a waltz, the familiar faces of her past began to circle. Young men who had once ignored her father's mounting debts now flocked to her, drawn by the new, terrifying prestige of the Ashford name. She was no longer a girl on the brink of ruin. She was the Duchess-to-be, a prize claimed by the most elusive predator in the North. But as the suitors bowed and offered their hands for the dance, she felt Mycroft's presence beside her sharpen into a cold, jagged edge. He did not intervene. He did not growl or make a scene. He simply stood there, a silent witness to the ritual he had catalogued for 3 years from the shadows. But Jennifer saw the way his jaw tightened, the way his gaze followed every hand that moved toward her waist, and the way he seemed to be counting the seconds of every polite interaction. "You are free to dance, Jennifer," he murmured, his voice so low it was nearly lost beneath the violins. "I have no claim on your movements, hey? The debt is settled, as we discussed." "And yet you look as though you are watching a murder," she replied, her voice steady. "Is this not what you wanted? To see me back in the light?" Mycroft turned his head, his dark eyes meeting hers with a raw intensity that made the surrounding ballroom fade into a blur of meaningless motion. "I have spent 3 years watching you dance with others from the back of the theater and the edges of gardens. I have memorized the way you adjust your pace to suit a partner who is beneath you. I have sat in the dark and felt the ache of being the only man who knew the thoughts you were hiding behind your smile." He stepped closer, his shadow falling over her, shielding her for a moment from the heat of the candles. "I thought I could endure it tonight. I thought that by bringing you here, I was proving that I was not your jailer. But I find that I am a man of far less character than I believed. I have watched you dance with ghosts for 3 years, Jennifer. I cannot watch you dance with them tonight." The confession was not a command, it was an admission of defeat. The man who had engineered a collapse to ensure her safety was now admitting that he could not survive the very freedom he had restored to her. He wasn't jealous of the men, he was jealous of the distance. "I cannot watch you perform for them anymore," he whispered, his gloved hand twitching at his side. "Not when I know that you are the only person who has ever truly looked back at me." Jennifer looked at the crowded floor, at the partners waiting for her to play the role of the beautiful object, and then back at the man who had burned his own hands to build her a sanctuary. She realized that the dance no longer held any music for her. The only rhythm that mattered was the one they had shared in the silence of the North. She didn't want the light of the Pembroke ballroom, she wanted the man who was willing to stay in the dark with her. The noise of the Pembroke ballroom became a dull roar behind the heavy glass doors as Jennifer stepped out onto the stone balcony. The London air was thick with coal smoke and the distant rattle of hansom cabs, a stark contrast to the crystalline silence of Wiltshire. Mycroft followed her, his presence a sudden, heavy warmth against the cool night. He did not stand beside her, he leaned against the shadowed pillar, his profile a sharp, lonely line against the city's hazy glow. "My mother died in that fire," he said abruptly, the words falling like stones into a still pond. He didn't look at her, his gaze fixed on the dark ribbon of the Thames in the distance. "The same one that claimed my hands. She didn't leave because she couldn't bear the ruin of her son, Jennifer. She died trying to reach me, and I spent the next 20 years believing I was the ash she left behind. My father turned Ashford into a tomb of silence, and I became its most dutiful ghost." Jennifer felt the breath leave her. The man she had viewed as an omnipotent architect was revealing a foundation built on grief and isolation. "I grew up in the shadows of that house, learning to read people by the sounds of their footsteps and the cadence of their whispers through closed doors," he continued, his voice dropping to a low, rough hum. "I survived by observing, by knowing everything about a world I was too damaged to join. And then came your debut." He finally turned to look at her, the moonlight catching the silver of his eyes. "It was the Henderson Ball. You were standing near the punch bowl, surrounded by the usual vultures, and you were laughing. It wasn't the polite, tinkling sound the other girls practiced in their mirrors. It was a real, transformative laugh, something sharp and intelligent. You were laughing at a joke no one else in that circle understood. He took a step toward her, the distance between them shrinking until she could feel the frantic beat of his heart beneath his coat. I was standing in the alcove, hidden by the velvet drapes, and I realized in that moment that I had spent my entire life watching the world, but you were the first person I actually wanted to know. I didn't just want to see you, Jennifer. I wanted to know what was funny. I wanted to know the mind that found humor in such a dismal room. So you began the collection, Jennifer whispered, her anger finally dissolving into a terrifying, profound empathy. I began the study, he corrected softly. I told myself it was a game, a way to pass the years in my tomb. But the more I learned, the more I realized that you were just as isolated in that light as I was in my darkness. You were performing for them, masking your brilliance, hiding your disappointments. I didn't buy your father's debt to own you. I bought it because I couldn't bear the thought of that laugh being silenced by someone who would never bother to ask why you were laughing in the first place. He reached out, his gloved hand hovering near her face, a silent question he didn't dare ask. I am a man who has lived 1,000 lives in the margins of yours. I know I am a thief of your history. But on that night, 3 years ago, I didn't see a prize. I saw a partner, and I have been trying to find my way back to that balcony ever since. The return to Ashford Manor felt less like a retreat and more like a reclaiming. The sage-green walls of her chamber no longer felt like a cage, but a canvas, and the man standing in the doorway was no longer the architect of her ruin, but the mirror to her soul. The fire in the hearth crackled, throwing long, amber shadows across the room where no mirrors hung, a space where Jennifer finally felt she could exist without the weight of an audience. Mycroft stood near the foot of the bed, his silhouette sharp against the firelight. He had removed his coat, but his gloves remained, dark and stark against the white linen of his shirt sleeves. The air between them was thick, not with the suffocating pressure of a debt, but with the electric tension of a choice long delayed. Jennifer moved toward him, her movements deliberate, her gaze never wavering from his. She reached out, her fingers brushing the leather at his wrist. "The debt is gone, Mycroft," she whispered, her voice steady. "The papers are ash. You told me the door was never locked. Tonight, I am the one closing it." He didn't move, his breath hitching in the quiet room. "Jennifer," he said, his voice a low, warning rasp. "You are under no obligation. The house, the books, the protection, they are yours regardless of what happens in this room. You do not have to pay me in this way. I will not have you trade yourself to me as you were traded by your father." "I am not trading," she countered, her hands moving to the first button of his waistcoat. "I am choosing. For 3 years, you watched me. You learned the rhythm of my mind and the shape of my silences. You are the only man who ever bothered to see me. Do you truly think I would give this moment to anyone else?" Even as she drew him closer, Mycroft caught her hands, his grip firm yet trembling. "Wait," he urged, his eyes searching hers with a desperate, searching intensity. "Look at me. Look at what I am. If we do this, there's no going back to the fiction of the Duke and his ward. You are choosing a man who is broken, who has lived in your shadows for so long he barely knows how to stand in the light. Are you certain? This is not a requirement of your stay." "I am certain," she said, and this time she didn't just speak the words, she reached for the hem of his glove. Slowly, she peeled back the leather, exposing the silver landscape of his scars to the warm light of the fire. She didn't flinch. She leaned down and pressed a lingering kiss to the center of his palm, the place where the fire had left its deepest mark. Mycroft let out a jagged, broken sound, a release of breath he seemed to have been holding for a lifetime. "You are not obligated," he whispered one last time, his forehead resting against hers, his voice thick with a vulnerability that far outweighed his physical scars. "I am here because I want to be known," Jennifer replied, her hands sliding up to frame his face, drawing him down into the heat of her own resolve. "And because I want to finally know the man who went to such lengths to find me." When he finally pulled her into him, it wasn't the act of a creditor claiming his due, it was the desperate, reverent surrender of a man who had finally been invited out of the dark. In the silence of the room built for her, Jennifer realized that for the first time in her life, she wasn't performing. She was simply being loved. Hello, dear fanatic. Please hit the subscribe button and don't miss a story from our vault. The seasons at Ashford Manor turned with a quiet, relentless beauty, the sage-green walls of Jennifer's chambers absorbing the pale gold of a Wiltshire autumn. But within the sanctuary, a new silence had begun to take root. Jennifer sat by the window, her hand resting instinctively over the silk of her skirts, feeling the strange, thrumming secret of her own body. The morning sickness had been easy enough to hide behind the guise of a lingering cold, but the realization was undeniable. She was carrying a child. She had expected joy, or perhaps a sharp, clear fay. Instead, she felt a profound, shimmering uncertainty. She looked at the shelves of books, the meticulously curated history of her life that Mycroft had built, and wondered if he would see this new life as the ultimate addition to his collection or as an intrusion he hadn't engineered. For a man who lived by observation and calculated outcomes, a child was a wild, unpredictable variable. She found herself keeping the truth locked away, wanting to hold this one piece of herself back until she knew whether the man who had memoized her past could truly embrace a future he couldn't control. Mycroft, however, was a man who lived in the nuances of her behavior. He noted the way she skipped the morning tea he had once seen her crave. He saw the subtle change in the way she walked and the new, distant light in her eyes when they sat together in the library. But for the first time in 3 years, his ledger failed him. He lacked the context for her withdrawal. The atmosphere in the manor grew heavy with a familiar, suffocating intimacy. To Mycroft, Jennifer's quietness was not the silence of a secret, but the silence of a departure. He watched her from the doorway of the study, his scarred hands clenched at his sides, interpreting her pensive stays at the garden as a longing for the world beyond his gates. He saw the way she touched her stomach and assumed it was a gesture of heartache, a physical manifestation of the regret he had always feared would eventually bloom within her. "The carriage is always at your disposal, Jennifer," he said one evening, his voice a low, jagged rasp that broke the stillness of the room. He was standing by the fireplace, the shadows casting his features into a mask of grim endurance. "I have noticed the way you look at the road lately. If the walls of Ashford have finally become too narrow, if the weight of my presence has become the burden I feared it would be, you need only say the word." Jennifer looked up, startled. She saw the raw, controlled agony in his expression, the look of a man who was already preparing to lose the only thing he had ever truly found. He had spent years watching her, yet in his fear, he was blind to the very life they had created. He misinterpreted her hesitation as a prelude to goodbye, his mind already drafting the final chapter of her collection, the one where she leaves. "Is that what you see, Mycroft?" she asked, her voice trembling with the weight of the truth she hadn't yet shared. "In all your observations, in all your years of watching me, is that truly what you think I am preparing for?" "I think I am a man who bought a bird and forgot that birds are meant for the sky," he replied, turning his back to her to stare into the embers. "And I think I would rather see you fly than watch you wither in a room I painted to please a girl who no longer exists." He didn't see her move toward him, his own grief acting as a veil. He was waiting for her to confirm his fears, unaware that the secret she held was the only thing that could finally bridge the gap between his observation and her reality. The study was cold, the fire having burnt down to a heap of gray ash that mirrored the drained color of Mycroft's face. On the mahogany desk, where the opera programs and the miniature had once served as evidence of his obsession, lay a new set of documents. These were not ledgers of ruin or promissory notes, but the instruments of her total restoration. Mycroft did not look at her as she approached. He stood by the tall window, his silhouette a jagged line against the encroaching Wiltshire dusk. "I have spent the last week in correspondence with my solicitors in London," he said, his voice stripped of its resonant hum, sounding instead like dry leaves skittering over stone. "The papers before you are the final accounts. Your father's debts are not merely purchased, they are cancelled. The Lawrence estate has been refinanced under a trust that he cannot touch, ensuring a fortune that will sustain you for a lifetime." Jennifer reached out, her fingers grazing the heavy parchment. She didn't need to read the fine print to understand the magnitude of the gesture. It was a complete reversal of the day her trunks were packed in secret. "And the third document?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "An annulment," Mycroft replied, finally turning to face her. The shadows under his eyes were deep, and his scarred hands were clasped tightly behind his back, as if he feared reaching for her one last time. "It is drafted on the grounds of non-consummation. I have used my influence to ensure it will pass through the ecclesiastical courts without a whisper of scandal touching your name. You will be Miss Jennifer Lawrence again, with a dowry that will make you the most sought-after woman in England." He took a slow, painful breath, the air whistling in his chest. I told you once that I engineered the ruin to ensure I was the one to catch you. I realize now that as long as those debts exist, as long as this house is your only sanctuary, I am still holding you by the throat. I will not keep you through obligation, Jennifer. I have taken enough of your history without your consent. I will not take your future as well." The silence that followed was suffocating. The very freedom she had craved in her father's study was now lying on the desk, crisp and indifferent. Mycroft was offering to erase himself from her life, to become the ghost he had been for 3 years, leaving her with the wealth and the name but without the witness. "You are giving me back everything," she said, looking from the papers to the man who had burned his own life to build her a world. "I am giving you the choice I stole," he countered, his gaze unwavering despite the visible tremor in his jaw. "The carriage is ready. You can be in London by daybreak. You can find a man who doesn't need to hide in the shadows, a man who doesn't have ledgers filled with your secrets. You can finally be unobserved." He stepped back, retreating into the deeper shadows of the library, literally making space for her to leave. He was waiting for her to take the papers and run, believing his love was a cage she was only waiting to fly from. He did not know that the woman standing before him was no longer the girl in the blue silk dress, and that the unobserved life he offered felt, for the first time, like the coldest exile of all. The carriage had traveled 10 miles toward London before the silence of the road became louder than Jennifer could bear. The rhythm of the horse's hooves sounded like a countdown, each strike a deliberate erasure of the only place where she had been truly seen. She looked at the annulment papers resting in her lap, the weight of her freedom, and realized that returning to a world where she was merely a face in a ballroom was not liberation, it was a return to the dark. She tapped the ceiling of the carriage, her voice sharp and certain as she ordered the driver to turn back. It was long after midnight when the grey stone of Ashford Manor emerged from the mist. The house was nearly dark, save for a single amber glow flickering from the second floor. Jennifer did not wait for the footman. She pushed open the heavy oak doors and moved through the foyer, her breath hitching in the cold air. She climbed the stairs with a frantic, focused energy, her heart hammering against her ribs with a truth that had finally outgrown her fear. She found him in her room, the sage-green sanctuary he had built for her. Mycroft was sitting in the chair by the cold hearth, his head bowed, his scarred hands resting limp and open on his knees. He looked diminished, a man who had finally surrendered his ghost-like watch over the world. He didn't look up when the door opened, likely believing the sound to be the wind or a servant come to clear the remains of a life he had just sent away. "I thought I told the staff I was not to be disturbed," he said, his voice a hollow, broken shell of itself. "The staff didn't let me in, Mycroft. I let myself in." He stiffened, his head snapping up. The shock that crossed his face was a raw, jagged thing. He stood slowly, his eyes searching her face as if she were a phantom conjured by his own grief. "Jennifer, the carriage, you should be halfway to London. The papers. The papers are in the mud of the driveway," she said, stepping into the circle of light. She moved toward him until she could see the silver ridges of his scars, the marks of the fire he had survived. "You spent 3 years engineering a world for me, and then you tried to give me back a life where I am a stranger to everyone, including myself. Did you truly think I would prefer a restored fortune to the only man who knows the color of my soul? I gave you the choice," he whispered, his voice trembling. "I will not have you stay out of pity, or because you feel you have no other harbor. Look at me, Mycroft," she commanded, reaching out to take his hands, her fingers weaving through his. "For 3 years, you were the observer. Tonight, you are the witness. I am not here because of a debt, or promissory note, or father's ruin. I am here because I do not want to be unobserved ever again. I am choosing. For the first time in my life, I am choosing the person who sees me." She leaned in, pressing her forehead against his, her voice dropping to a fierce, low hum. "And there's one more thing you haven't catalogued yet. A variable you didn't calculate." She took his hand and placed it firmly over her stomach, holding it there until he felt the steady, rhythmic heat of her skin. The silence that followed was no longer the silence of a tomb, but the breathless, shivering quiet of a beginning. Mycroft's eyes widened, a slow, staggering realization dawning in the depths of his gaze. For the first time, the collector had found something he hadn't sought, and the architect found himself standing in a house that was no longer a cage, but a home.